form of this international symposium is 3 panels. And the first of those has 3 experts from Mexico and from the United States talking about Mexico and the U.S., the context of our shared concerns with human security. And I'd like to present the 3 people that we have here, starting with Dr. Roberto Moreno on my left, from Mexico, from the State University of Mexico, in the state of Mexico, from the campus at Omega Mega. And he is also the director of the International Institute for Administrative Sciences and Education, and he is its managing director. And we have known each other for over 20 years in professional collaborative activities. On my immediate right, Dr. Edgar Cota Torres, who is a professor in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences at UCCS and an expert on cross-border relations between the U.S. and Mexico. And finally, Mr. Craig Conway from the U.S. Department of State and U.S. Northern Command. And what we're going to do here is to talk about U.S. and Mexico relations in the context of underlying trends and events. And we're going to talk specifically about the issues that have arisen with migration and drug policies. We're going to talk about how we work together to solve problems. We're going to talk about how each country has its own agenda of things to work on together. And we're going to use the things that my colleagues and I at University of Colorado in Colorado Springs and throughout Mexico and the United States are doing to improve relationships from a long-term point of view. The thing to understand about drug trafficking and migration with Mexico is that all of this is a negative byproduct of the tremendous expansion in legal trade and commerce between the U.S. and Mexico, which started with NAFTA. And when we closed down drug routes from the Caribbean into Florida, we opened routes, or the drug cartels had to find other routes for transportation, which meant through Mexico. And what we have done, and what Mexico has done together, is assist, because of the trade, and assist not in a legal manner or a desired manner, but as an unintentional consequence in the formation of drug cartels. And what these have done is to move very effectively and efficiently goods, services, and people in, like you would expect of Amazon or Walmart, only they're the other side of the coin. We have another issue with human migration. In the past year, over 60,000 Guatemalans and Hondurans fled poverty, violence, repression, rape, and machismo to go to the United States. And to do that, they had to go through Mexico. So it's a condition that is bad for Mexico. It creates challenges for the United States. And it's another issue that can only be resolved by working together effectively as 2 countries who are neighbors. Mexico is often unable to secure its own borders, as is the United States. And the trafficking routes for drugs that go through Mexico focus on the Caribbean coast, the West Coast, and the North and South borders. And the problem in Mexico, one issue, is a culture of over-centralization and authoritarian rule by the central government. And what this does is to reduce government capacity in those areas of the country that are along the northern, southern, eastern, and western borders. And the combination of reduced government capacity, TCOs that are very well organized, well funded, and well informed about what happens in both countries, and very aggressive business conglomerates, is that you get a problem that both countries need to work on together. What you have in Mexico is a vicious cycle. And there are vicious cycles and there are virtuous cycles. The vicious cycle in Mexico is that the drug cartels spur a government response that is militaristic and authoritarian. And this goes against the creation of civil society and the growth of citizens as owners of government rather than as its subjects. If you combat TCOs, as the Calderon administration did, by using the army against citizens, then the army treats the citizens as if they were the enemies of the country rather than as citizens. And we have seen some of this in the culture of police responses to our own citizens in the United States. So whenever I point a finger at Mexico in one direction, I know that I have three fingers pointing back at me. So there is plenty of responsibility to be shared on both sides. In the United States, what we have done is to focus on the southern border as a security concern following 9/11. Even though all of the 9/11 terrorists entered the United States from Canada, we built a wall between Mexico and the U.S. And this wall has had a number of impacts, social, economic, and political. And the problem is that in the United States, Mexico is not a high priority topic on our agenda. In all of the presidential debates in 2012, neither candidate mentioned Mexico one time. And what I hope to do, what we hope to do with this conference is to stimulate a dialogue and a discussion that treats relations with the United States as if Mexico and the United States were friendly neighbors, like the relationship that we have with Canada. Think of a border as something that unites as well as divides us. In the past, we've cooperated with Mexico when it's been to our advantage, and Mexico has cooperated with us. But this cooperation takes a lot of pressure and a lot of unanimity. The problem is because within each country there are so many national and international stakeholders that it becomes difficult to influence policy. We think of Mexico as a friendly neighbor, but also, as Edgar will tell us, as a country of them rather than us, in a sense that we do not use when we talk about relations with Canada. We think about the consequences of migration and legal and illegal migration, our own systems of education, criminal justice, and health. What we don't think about is that the United States has always needed labor from Mexico. And Mexico has always needed the flow of remittance money and employment money from the United States. Mexico has great admiration for the United States as a center of economic activity and as a country of opportunity. But also, there is tremendous discrimination, and the Mexicans understand this, against Mexico in the United States. And they point to many events in our shared history. We talk about Plymouth Rock and Jamestown and the arrival of the English, and we ignore the fact that the Spanish in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and St. Augustine were here almost a century before the English. And we forget that for over 300 years, this country, the United States, this region of our country, was part of Mexico, the Spanish Empire, and what they call Nueva España. So we have had 150 years of a difficult relationship on top of almost 300 years of a more positive one. The way to think about this situation now is to see it as an opportunity that is too important and too good to waste. What we can do is to build sustainable binational research networks. We can focus on long-term shared objectives, and we can strengthen the networks among academics, professionals, and elected and appointed officials that are vital in moving this agenda of shared policy making forward. As you heard earlier, Mexico is the United States' third largest trading partner, and we are Mexico's largest. We have a shortage of younger workers required for economic growth, while Mexico has a surplus of labor. Not a birth rate that's much higher than ours right now, but a surplus because of a high birth rate in the 70s and 80s of workers who are available to help with our own economic development. This is the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, and we succeeded in making a linkage between the US and Canada that provides for the movement of capital, of services, and goods. If we could, like the European Union, provide for the freer movement of people, we would be capable of competing on any level in the world, certainly with the European Union, and in the future with China. I mean, you've got to keep your eyes on the long-term objective. And I see a three-nation powerhouse with only 3 languages and only 3 countries, which is much better than the 27 languages the European Union is working with. But we can only do this if we frame policy issues as intermestic opportunities to improve relations, rather than as problems or situations that divide us. A number of us over the past few years have been working on a project of shared research between the United States and Mexico that focused first on drug trafficking. And that was the subject of a number of international conferences, 2 books, one published in English in the United States, one published in Spanish in Mexico, with 2 contributing co-editors, Roberto Moreno and myself, and about 20 authors. And by publishing this book in 2 languages, in 2 countries, and with 20 contributing authors, half Mexican and half from the United States, what we are doing is establishing a model for what we hope will be the way forward to resolve the intermestic policy issues that face us. The way you do it, of course, working within each country, is to take advantage of the opportunities that are offered. In Mexico's case, there's a system called SNI, Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, National Performance Evaluation System for academic researchers, that provides considerable financial rewards for scholars who produce internationally, who publish in international journals, and who attend conferences in the US. So we can take advantage of that. We can build networks of public administration. We can combine our physical presence with the virtual opportunities to maintain relationships online once they're established. And I note the Good Governance Worldwide website operated by the American Society for Public Administration. As Consul General Bayo said, we should start looking at a shared agenda that would cover the areas that are most important from a long-term perspective. Security, facilitation of legitimate commerce and transportation, economic development, water management, environmental protection, and migration. We should develop some shared strategies for both countries that think about the border as something that connects us and develops shared national policies for a border area that is 2,000 miles long and 150 miles wide on each side of the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo. 2 names, same river. Once we work on political accord, we can also work on administrative accord, because most of the problems are solved by administrators. Each country has to take some steps. We've got to figure out a way in the United States of addressing the problem of migrants who have been living in this country for years without appropriate documentation. We've got to look towards the future and provide for the future migration of workers, depending on economic and political circumstances. We should adjust migration from Mexico to the U.S. based on our own needs for economic development and a skilled workforce. We've got to allocate adequate resources for border protection and for making sure that those persons who enter the country do so legally. Once we have these structures in place, these laws in place, Mexico should do things to limit their own flow of migrants, both Mexicans and migrants through Mexico from Central America. We should look at our perception of Mexico, which is paradoxical. On the one hand, Mexico is them, not us. But on the other, we're good neighbors. Mexico has to take steps to eliminate the poverty, discrimination, and a paradox in the Mexican psyche, which is to say we're proud of being both European and indigenous. What they say is mestizaje. We are a culture of both Europeans and indigenous peoples. But at the same time, there is a great deal of discrimination in Mexico, particularly in southern Mexico, in Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas, and of course against the migrants from Central America. Each country must look at its own laws, federal, state, and local, in terms of how we deal with drug trafficking. There are three approaches. One of them is a war on drugs. The other is complicity, in other words, saying that you have a policy against drugs, but actually allowing the cartels to operate. And the other is some form of change in drug policy that might avoid us paying for two armies, drug enforcement and the cartels, and paying the bill for both of them while doing nothing to reduce the demand or the supply of drugs. Every time we have a war on something, I'm afraid it's going to last forever. And the war on drugs has been lasting since 1971. And I don't think anybody would say that we're any closer to a solution than we were 45 years ago. What we're doing with this symposium is offering an arena for civic engagement and offering a perspective on the general issue of relations between the U.S. and Mexico that will hopefully move things forward by offering a model of the kind of discussion and the kind of cooperation that is required if we are to be the kinds of neighbors we need to be in order to achieve both of our long-term strategic objectives as countries. So thank you very much for your presence and for your attention. And let me introduce my friend and colleague, Edgar Cota, to discuss his perspective on underlying relations. Edgar?
First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for this opportunity. Of course, Dr. Klingner for the invitation, as well as the audience and colleagues participating in this symposium. As you can see from the title of this first slide, Mexico and the United States, Cooperative Approaches to Shared Human Security, México y Estados Unidos, Aproximaciones Colaborativas Compartidas para la Seguridad Humana. There you have a little bit of my background, and as you can see from the first section, I come from a literary and Culture Studies background. I teach in the Department of Languages and Cultures, and I specialize on literary and cultural manifestations that emerge from the U.S., Mexico, and other borders interacting. I would like to start by reading a couple of paragraphs of a story that I published in a book titled Déjame que te cuente. And I will read it in Spanish, and you can follow in English on the screen. This is actually a portion of my story. Sin duda, la vida ofrece muchas oportunidades y en ocasiones también limita. Esta frase me remonta a las palabras que hace varias décadas me compartió mi madre. Hijo, hemos hecho muchos sacrificios para que tú nacieras en Estados Unidos. Nosotros somos muy humildes y esa es tu herencia. Ahí tú sabes si la aprovechas. Tenía unos 12 años cuando por primera vez escuché lo que se convirtió en una motivación. Esas palabras de mi mamá me marcaron por el resto de mi vida. A continuación compartiré cómo se logró la herencia que en vida me dejó mi madre y cómo paulatinamente me vi obligado a dejar mi país de origen, cualquiera que ese sea. Eso de crecer en la frontera puede brindar un sentido alterno, un ir y venir, una penetración de límites, el cruce de un puente. Las metáforas son bastantes y dependiendo de la condición en la que la persona se ve insertada, la frontera entre México y Estados Unidos adquiere múltiples significados y consecuentemente una infinidad de recuerdos. La ciudad fronteriza a la que me refiero es Mexicali, en el estado de Baja California. Sí, allá por el norte, muy al norte de México. As you can see, that is part of my personal story as a migrant to the U.S. And I would like to just get a couple of points across. And one of them is that each person that decides to migrate to the U.S. has their own personal story, which is what we typically tend to forget. Again, we're talking about human representation there, not only statistics and numbers. And that is one of the key concepts that we need to keep in mind. It's great to have new laws, reforms, policies. Of course, it's great, even better to have it implemented, which sometimes doesn't occur as we wish it would. But a key element when we deal with human migration is, which might sound redundant, is to remember that we're dealing with humans. Okay? And another thing that we need to keep in mind is that this is not an exclusive U.S.-Mexico border phenomenon. Europe is dealing with a similar situation, which is becoming more and more complex, and they're dealing with some situation and complex issues similar to what we face with our neighbors to the south. I would like to share a few of the recent news that some of them from last year, some of them from a couple of days ago. And as you can see on this slide, there's quite a huge immigration movement from Africa and from the Middle East to European countries. We're talking about thousands of people trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, okay? And as a result of that, we're seeing thousands of people dying on a weekly basis, from what I read on the news yesterday. A couple of days ago, about 5,800 migrants were rescued in precarious vessels in the coast of Libya, and 10 bodies were recovered in less than 48 hours. 2 weeks ago, 900 migrants drowned in the Mediterranean trying to cross those borders. Another similar situation, it's in Colombia, which has become a transit country for Asian and African migrants, as well as Cubans, trying to get to the United States or Canada via Colombia. Nearly 1,800 traffic victims were identified by the Colombian government last year. Once again, these are pretty drastic numbers. A lot of people are losing their lives in this attempt, and we need to think a few minutes, why are these people willing to risk their lives in order to make it to these countries? And we know some of those answers. Okay. Now, if we take a quick look at what's been going on in Central American countries with migrants crossing borders in Central America and crossing through Mexico in order to make it to the U.S. We can see on some of these pictures that the condition to make it to the U.S. are oftentimes inhumane. And a big percentage of these people will be raped. A big percentage of these people will be robbed. Some of them will be assassinated. Some of them will be disappeared. This is something terrible that has been going on to people from Central America that try to make it to the U.S. and have to do it on top of those trains called La Bestia, the Beast. Also, a more of a situation with child migrants from Central America. We can see that this has been kind of a new migration pattern, at least in the numbers and the age of migrants from Central America. We're seeing the numbers, as you can see on these graphs. The percentages are really grown. And some of these children try to make it to the U.S. on their own without the company of an adult. Okay, of course, I think we're all aware of the situation as it was in the news last summer. The following slide shows the number of people living in the country in which they were not born. Again, you see quite a few million in the U.S., in Russia, Germany, France, Canada, Australia. And the list continues. As my colleague mentioned a few minutes ago, we're witnessing a huge migration movement towards the north, and we're also witnessing a huge migration movement towards Europe. This has become a global humanitarian crisis. In the process of these migration processes, there is a lot of abuse, and there's a lot of gangs, there's a lot of criminal organizations that abuse these people and that try to make a living out of this. Of course, there are some positive and negative aspects to this migration. The list above columns could be quite intense, as well as the causes that trigger this movement. It seems to me that some economic, political, and social systems are not benefiting every country, and that global wealth is concentrated in specific regions, and other areas are becoming more impoverished. As we could see in the previous slides, some of these systems are backfiring on the rich economies, or how we would say in Spanish, se está saliendo el tiro por la culata. What are some of the possible solutions? I think that's one of the goals of this symposium. But again, I would like to underline that we're dealing with a huge population of human beings. I believe that in order to arrive to a solution or an immigration reform, we must become sensitive to this situation. Again, We're not dealing only with numbers and statistics. And once we make this situation personal, then we might have an idea of what is going on, or we might have an idea of what these people are going through. To me, it was pretty easy. I mean, my first border crossing from Mexico to the U.S. was when my mom was pregnant, and she decided to give birth to me in the U.S. side, in Los Angeles, a city that I hardly know because a week after I was born, I was back in Mexico. But that's not the typical scenario, I guess, for a number of people. The human beings that I'm referring to could be a family member, could be our neighbors, could be the nannies of our kids, could be our kids' classmates, could be someone that is doing our dishes in our kitchen and when we go to a restaurant, someone that is cleaning the rooms in the hotel, or it could be an engineer working in a corporation. But this is not Mexico's or Africa's or Central America's problems or issues or situations. This is something that we need to deal with and definitely work in a relation that involves more than one country. And I think what we're doing here today, it's part of that. As we know, the situation is becoming more complex. And the more we wait to act, it's going to become more complex. More people are going to be trafficked. More people are going to be abused. More people are going to be sex slaves. More people are going to be assassinated, raped. More families are going to be broken. And that is something that we cannot tolerate anymore. And I'm not going to get into the drug trafficking situation. I'm sure someone will address that. And that's a whole different scenario as well that contributes to this to an extension. Again, building more walls is not the solution. We are seeing that right now. We saw that last summer with the huge migration from children from Central America. People will continue to risk everything to provide the basics for their loved ones. Again, I come from a literary and cultural studies background. And I deal mostly with books. Some of these books are reflections of social patterns. Some of them are fictions. But the way I believe I contribute to this dynamic is by teaching my students about these situations through literature and through cultural studies. Because for some of them, this situation is really, really, really far away from what they've experienced. And I understand. This might seem like a very simplistic solution or conclusion to a very complex situation. But we need to create some awareness as well. And that might be one of the reasons why we're still dealing with a debate about immigration reforms. The essays that I have published deal with situations that in a way represent the underprivileged groups, prostitutes, migrants from different backgrounds, women, poor, borders, etc. The books that I published deal with cultural and literary borders and are joining ventures, publishing ventures between, in the case of 4 of those books that you see, between University of Colorado Springs and La Universidad Autónoma de Baja California. Those institutions collaborated to the publication of these books, which deal with migration, with literature, with short stories, which deal with reflecting the reality that we're living along the border. This is what I consider to be part of my heritage, my herencia to my daughters, and hopefully to those who take my classes and hear my presentations. Create some kind of awareness in order to be more human when we try to address this situation. Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Craig Conway from the U.S. Department of State and currently working with U.S. Northern Command for his perspective on underlying issues between the United States and Mexico.
Thank you, Don. I'd like to thank, first of all, UCCS for organizing this symposium. This is tremendously beneficial, I think, and I appreciate your willingness to partner with Northern Command on this as well. Having this exchange of views, I think, is tremendously helpful, and I think we at Northern Command will learn a lot from the perspectives that we have heard, that we will hear, have heard and will hear today. And in addition, I hope that our perspectives will also be beneficial to the academic participants in this symposium. I'd like to thank Don, both you and Edgar, for your great presentations. I learned a lot from both of them. I would like to start by fully agreeing that the issues that we're dealing with in the U.S.-Mexico relationship are extremely complex. There are so many layers, historical layers, lots of history, lots of contentious history, lots of mistrust on both sides of the border. And Don, while I will not take issue with the impressive vision that you've laid out, I will take slight issue with your assertion that Mexico is not a high priority. I will agree with you that for many years Mexico has not been a high priority for the United States, but I think that's beginning to change. 21 years after NAFTA, I think the United States, policymakers, business leaders, have a growing appreciation for the importance of the North American community, for the importance of the North American economy, and for Mexico's role in both of those. Don, you mentioned the issue of migration across the borders, and this is a challenge, absolutely, as well. Edgar, you mentioned, this is a challenge that we have to work through. But I'll just throw in a couple data points that I think are noteworthy. First of all, we're now at a point where the majority of illegal migrants across the U.S.-Mexico border are coming from Central America, not from Mexico. And one of the reasons why is Mexico has become, and is on a trajectory to become, the industrial center of the North American economy. This is hugely important. And this is, as you said, this is a tremendous opportunity that we need to take advantage of. And I think the business community in the United States fully appreciates that. Our embassy in Mexico City fully appreciates that and has partnered with the government of Mexico to do what we can under the Merida Initiative and under our high-level economic dialogue to further strengthen the integration between our economies to build economic ties. The fact that the majority of migrants are coming from Central America, I think, represents an opportunity for Mexico and the United States to do more together, to partner in Central America, to address security issues in Central America, and to do what we can to build prosperity in Central America. The numbers from the Department of Homeland Security for fiscal year 2015, demonstrate a striking decline in the number of unaccompanied children and the number of Central American migrants who are being detained on our own southern border. The reason why is because under the Merida Initiative, we have been working more closely with the Mexican government on border security on Mexico's southern border. And then we've also seen the Mexican government taking action against La Bestia and against cartels that are exploiting migrants. I think this is just the beginning of what our two countries can do together, and I hope that this symposium can explore some of these issues. Obviously, what I've described so far are very early initial successes. We obviously have a lot more of hard work to do, and I think this symposium can be a big part of that. In addition to being the industrial center, being a trajectory of, on trajectory to become the center of the North American, industrial center of the North American economy. I think Mexico is in many ways also the center of gravity of North American security, and I think there's a growing realization of that. I'm going to speak in a little while about the Merida Initiative, just to give folks in this room a better understanding of what that program is and what it entails. The 6 priorities that were outlined, I think, are laudable priorities, and some of that work is already being done under the Merida Initiative. But government-to-government cooperation is not sufficient to solve these problems. It's going to take much more holistic approach through academic networks, public administration networks, but also on a community-to-community level. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in my remarks. So we have, obviously, we understand the growing interconnectedness of the United States and Mexico. Our economies are reaching the point where we're now dependent on one another, which means we need to take joint approaches to solving problems. We have our economic relationship. We have $1.4 billion of two-way trade crossing the border legally every day. We have hundreds of thousands of legal border crossings every day. We are very quickly moving toward an integrated society. So we have to work together. We have to develop joint approaches to reduce violence, combat transnational organized crime, enhance law enforcement cooperation, and stem the flow of illicit money and arms across our common border. The problem is not just in Mexico, and I think our leaders are beginning to realize that. In his January meeting with President Peña Nieto, President Obama reaffirmed the U.S. determination to reduce the demand for illegal drugs in the United States and to combat the southbound flow of illegal guns and cash. If you look at the ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policies, National Drug Strategy, there's a heavy emphasis on drug demand. And this was something that President Obama came into office making a commitment to devote more resources to reducing demand. And that strategy has been backed up with federal grant dollars. If you look at the I don't have the exact statistics with me, but there are indications that the demand is starting to decline. Again, it's just the beginning, but I think we're seeing some progress in the right direction. You already heard General Dubey talk about the strength of our military cooperation. The key word he used was trust, and I think that's essential. Because you're right, Doug, it's not them versus us, it's us. We're in this together, right? And we have to work together. But in order to do that, we have to have trust on both sides of the border. And that governments can only do so much in terms of building that trust. What I'd like to do is talk now a little bit about the Merida Initiative, which is an unprecedented partnership between the United States and Mexico to address violence and criminality while strengthening the rule of law and respect for human rights. It's very important to understand that this is not a United States assistance program. The government of Mexico contributes $10 for every $1 that the U.S. government contributes to Merida. This is truly a partnership, and Mexico's doing most of the work through this partnership. We directly, through the Merida Initiative, we directly support programs to help Mexico train and equip its law enforcement agencies to promote a culture of lawfulness, implement justice reforms, and modernize the border between our two countries. Under Merida, thousands of federal and state police, prosecutors, investigators, judges, and justice sector professionals have received training. The United States has also supported Mexico's efforts to transition to an accusatory system of justice that is more effective and efficient. Federal and state police training academies have received new equipment and capabilities, as has Mexico's federal correction systems, forensics laboratories, and canine units and academies. Law enforcement agencies have received new information technology systems, as have Mexican courts. 5 Mexican federal agencies now use non-intrusive inspection equipment to detect drugs, weapons, and other contraband, making border crossings for cargo safer and more efficient. 88 federal offices under Merida now train employees on ethical behavior and culture of lawfulness. Over 7,500 schools in Mexico provide also culture of lawfulness training, which reaches almost 700,000 students every school year. So, again, I think that we're starting to see some progress in what we're able to do together, both in reducing violence and in promoting a culture of lawfulness in Mexico, or helping the Mexican government promote a culture of lawfulness. We still have a long way to go. Obviously, these are very complex challenges we're dealing with. Cooperation under the Merida Initiative is organized under 4 strategic pillars. The first pillar aims to disrupt the capacity of organized crime to operate. This goes far beyond interdiction, and this goes far beyond simply taking out what are called high-value targets, the leaders of cartels. What we do together under Merida is we go after a cartel's ability to operate. We attempt to disrupt their financing efforts, their supply and logistic chains, and basically make it more difficult for them to operate. The second pillar, that's just one pillar of Merida. The second pillar focuses on enhancing the capacity of Mexico's government and institutions to sustain the rule of law. And some of the statistics, some of the examples that I've just given you show what we're doing under that. The third pillar aims to improve border management to facilitate legitimate trade and movement of people while thwarting the flow of drugs, arms, and cash. This is key. I mean, the idea of facilitating trade, I think, is essential, because as our economies become more closely connected, we build trust between our 2 countries. The fourth pillar of Merida is one that I think deserves a lot more attention. This is the idea of building strong and resilient communities. And I think that this symposium in particular could offer a lot of input on ways that we can do that better. The fourth pillar is directly relevant to a discussion of human security, and it's directly relevant to a discussion of women, peace, and security. In addition to working to ensure that security forces and government officials share society's values and respect the rights of others, including those they perceive as adversaries, the fourth pillar focuses on placing appropriate emphasis on the role of civil society in encouraging accountability, oversight, and abuse prevention. Civil society is key. The role that communities play is key. There needs to be a demand for good governance coming from the population. I think there are some that are concerned by the protests that have taken place in Mexico, and there are some that are concerned about the protests that have taken place in Ferguson and Baltimore. I think those can be viewed as positive developments. When the citizens are willing to confront their governments and demand a more accountable government, demand good governments, demand an end to corruption, and demand that their rights be respected, that's a sign of a strong democracy, and that's a sign of tremendous potential. So that's key. Also key is the idea of building trust within communities. You have to strengthen a community, and you also have to make sure that the community trusts the authorities let me put it a different way. You have to build trust between authorities and the people whom the authorities are there to protect and to serve. This is obviously much easier said than done. Again, you need to look no further than Ferguson, Missouri, or Baltimore to realize that we have our own problems with those issues here in the United States, but they're essential. One of the ways that we've been working to strengthen communities is by working together with the Mexican government to expand economic opportunity. And I mentioned some of the work of our high-level economic dialogue, which has resulted in tangible accomplishments in civil aviation, telecommunications, energy security, border infrastructure, support to entrepreneurs, which is key, I think, in trade facilitation. And here I'm going to sort of leap ahead to this afternoon's discussion as well. Because another essential way to strengthen communities is by working to empower women. As Secretary Kerry has said, no country can get ahead if it leaves half of its people behind, which is why the United States believes gender equality is critical to our shared goals of prosperity, stability, and peace, and why investing in women and girls worldwide is critical to U.S. foreign policy. Research shows that progress in women's employment, health, and education can lead to greater economic growth and stronger communities. Evidence demonstrates that integrating women's perspectives into peace negotiations and security efforts helps prevent conflict and can lead to more durable peace agreements. Under the auspices of the 2012 Mexico-U.S. Memorandum of Understanding for the promotion of gender equality, the empowerment of women, and women's human rights, our two governments are working together to support the full participation of women in all sectors of both economies and both societies, or better said, our North American economy and our North American society. Our embassy is now working with the government of Mexico to develop an action plan for implementing this important agreement. In the meantime, we're supporting programs to increase opportunities for women working in Mexican law enforcement agencies, and we're also supporting Mexican efforts to develop a 40-hour gender-based violence awareness course for Mexican police first responders and investigators. We've also supported the creation and internal reorganization of units that assist domestic violence victims in Monterrey, Chihuahua, Ciudad Juarez, and Oaxaca. In 2012, the latest year for which figures are available, these units provided more than 16,000 victims with legal, social, or psychological support services. In addition to that, we've sponsored many public awareness campaigns designed to raise awareness of gender-based violence and trafficking in persons, in addition to mentorship programs aimed at encouraging women entrepreneurs and mentoring. However, despite these efforts, there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and I hope that this symposium can explore ways that the state of Colorado, NORTHCOM, and UCCS can work together with the government of Mexico and with communities in Mexico. Because again, this comes back to the idea of you need a community approach to solve some of these problems. You need to have this grassroots push from below, a demand for accountable government, and you've got to have communities that demand more from their authorities, both in the United States and in Mexico, as a first step toward building trust. So I'm hopeful there will be some positive discussion that comes out of this, both in terms of the community-to-community relationship, but also exploring what the U.S. and Mexico can do together in Central America. Thank you.
Our final presenter for this panel is my great friend and colleague, Dr. Roberto Moreno from Mexico, and he will talk about the landscape from a Mexican perspective that represents the finest efforts that I know among Mexican academics for strengthening relationships between the United States and Mexico so that together we can confront the intermestic, not domestic, the intermestic policy issues that together we must face.
I am Roberto Moreno Espinosa. I am professor of the University Autonomous Mexico State, Campus Amecameca. In first place, thanks for your invitation to my colleague and friend, Donald Evans Klingner, and Terry. Congratulations to University Colorado in Colorado Springs for the 50th anniversary Escuela Public Affairs, School Public Affairs. Congratulations. My presentation about two problems impact the human security, the trafficking, illegal drugs, and child immigration. Problems what Donald E. Klingner and subscribe. Debating in Latin America, Mexico, United States, in the international Congress de the ASPA, the CLAD, in el más reciente, Chicago, 2, in Montevideo, in Quito, and Puebla, en México. Sí, perfecto. También lo hemos presentado, también hemos debatido estos problemas a través de un libro que lo publica Taylor and Francis y que está por publicarse también en México. Son problemas de un alto impacto que me parece fundamental estarlos debatiendo constantemente. De ahí la relevancia, la enorme relevancia de eventos de esta naturaleza que, a mi manera de ver, representan un núcleo que después se transforma en una onda expansiva que va impactando diversos públicos y que va sembrando y planteando soluciones viables, soluciones factibles, interesantes, para resolver un problema que nos afecta a todos y que no hay evasión, no hay escapatoria. Tenemos que enfrentarlo de manera conjunta, de manera compartida, de manera cooperativa, porque de otra manera nos continuará desbordando el problema del tráfico de drogas ilegales, el crimen organizado, la inmigración infantil, que cada vez crece casi de manera exponencial, y que conjuntamente tendremos que encontrar los mecanismos más adecuados para resolver el problema. Ahí está mi título de mi presentación: Transboundary Governance to Common and Interdependent Problems Between Mexico and the United States. Esto. A ver. Creo que sigo sin entender. No va a funcionar. Ok. Bueno, the trafficking of illegal drugs. The illegal drugs trafficking is perhaps the most complicated of problems, embodying the perfect storm between the two countries. It is one that generates perverse links where various issues at stake, such as arms trafficking, production, rating and consumption of drugs and enervating, which cause a set of immeasurable social and personal injury in both countries. 3 minutos más. Bueno, si voy a disponer de 3 minutos más, aprovecho el tiempo mejor en español. Bueno, el planteamiento central está en que este problema complejo, que es de los que también planteamos como los problemas malditos, requiere que tendamos hacia una real gobernanza transfronteriza. Y no solamente estoy haciendo referencia al tráfico de drogas, sino también a todos los movimientos migratorios que están impactando a poblaciones diversas y de manera ya fundamental a la inmigración infantil, que es un problema prácticamente mundial. Y en esa perspectiva, si no conjuntamos esfuerzos, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, el gobierno de México, los gobiernos de Centroamérica, las comisiones de derechos humanos de México, de Centroamérica, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, me parece que esa es la perspectiva que tenemos de poder empezar a tender, a plantear alternativas que realmente tengan un impacto fundamental y positivo para resolver los problemas que a diario vemos y que en México, bueno, todo el mundo conocemos el caso, por ejemplo, de cómo se trasladan los niños, los inmigrantes del sur de México hacia los Estados Unidos en el tren que le llaman la Bestia, y todo el problema que les va provocando en términos de robos, violaciones, asesinatos y toda una serie de problemas, pero que es un problema focalizado en México, pero que definitivamente es un problema que compartimos con Estados Unidos. O sea, también es un problema de Estados Unidos, también es un problema de los países latinoamericanos. Aprecio que cada vez en México disponemos de un mayor número de organizaciones de la sociedad civil que estamos interesados en estar atendiendo el problema. Académicamente, les mencionaba yo en el inicio de mi intervención que lo estamos debatiendo a nivel continental. Estamos debatiendo a nivel continental el problema y cada vez encontramos que tiene impactos en diferentes públicos y apreciamos también que hay otros grupos que están interesados en atender el problema. Dados los tiempos, a mí no me queda más que reiterar el agradecimiento, destacar la relevancia, la importancia de ampliar este tipo de debates, ponerlos por escrito, difundirlos, encontrar soluciones conjuntas, porque de manera unilateral me parece que difícilmente lo vamos a poder hacer. Es un problema cuyas ópticas, cuyas formas de atenderlo es diferente a como lo ve Estados Unidos, a como lo vemos en México y a como lo vemos en diferentes regiones en el propio México, a como lo percibimos o como lo perciben en Centroamérica. Entonces, la alternativa que tenemos para resolver estos problemas son fundamentales, toda vez que sí son esenciales y sí impactan la seguridad humana. La seguridad humana, cuyos objetos de estudio son abordados en esta universidad de manera fundamental y que, por cierto, estamos muy interesados también en ampliar nuestro intercambio para conocer de manera más profunda los planteamientos que se hacen aquí a nivel de la seguridad humana que tanto se requiere en el caso mexicano. Ya se dijeron cifras, 120,000 muertos, alrededor de 30 y tantos mil desaparecidos en desaparición forzosa, y eso no ha parado. Entonces tenemos que seguir adelante. Les agradezco la atención, su comprensión y la invitación. Muchas gracias.